He's a full professor at Södertörn University in Sweden, and he is a lot of other things. He is co-founder and president of the Association for Research in Digital Interactive Narrative and the Associated Journal, that is up and running. He leads the INCORE Cost Action, which explores complexity representations in interactive storytelling. He has a book out recently. He's been working in this space with interactive digital storytelling for a really long time. I think probably about 20 years, maybe more. And he has a new book out very recently, which I think he'll tell us a little bit about also, which I've read and which I think is a really important book in this field. I'm absolutely delighted, as I said, to welcome Hartmut, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mads, for this wonderful introduction. And I also want to mention that Mads was one of the people who really made this book happen by providing, a lot of good commentary to it. All right. Okay, taking narrative seriously in video games. Well, let's see how that's going. Or understanding interactive digital narrative, IDN. Alright, so what I will be talking about is the, maybe sorry state of narrative in games. Of course, that's a bit of a provocation. And I will talk about the lasting damage of the ludology versus natology debate and other misunderstandings about narrative. I will talk about the power of narrative. Then I will talk about interactive digital narrative, present a framework for understanding IDN, and then we'll talk about a particular role that I see for such interactive digital narratives in representing complexity. About me, I'm an academic and an artist. I actually started studying at the university that dates from 1477, that's the University of Tübingen. But I did my master's in Berlin, and later I did a PhD in digital media at Georgia Tech. There's other things that I've done, including being CTO of a startup and a journalist. And here you see some of the videos and installation pieces I had in galleries in things like in cities like Porto and Copenhagen and in Paris. As Mads already mentioned, I was the main proposer and I'm chair of INCORE, which is a cost action network for an EU grant for capacity and network building and networking, has 230 members, 40 countries, and I'm the president of the Association for Research in Digital Interactive Narrative. One of the things we do is a yearly conference, the International Conference on Interactive Digital Storytelling, ICIDS. We are now in our 16th year, and it will happen in a couple of weeks in Kobe this year. If you're interested, you can still, register. Also, there is also an online hybrid version, so you can also participate from afar. We've been hybrid for like 2 years now. Okay, the state of narrative in games, and it's so wonderful that I got this 2-hour slot. Okay, well, let's see how that goes. Okay, there's plenty to talk about. The state of narrative in games. Well, I think, one, and again, this is meant as also as a bit of a provocation, but I think there's two issues here. One is narrative fundamentalism, and the other one is narrative indifference. So what is narrative fundamentalism? Well, it is sort of the belief that all narrative is like literature and movies, right? So, and that creates sort of the fundamentalist argument, since video games are not like books or film, they cannot be narrative. And that is, in a nutshell, the underlying argument that makes people believe that video game and narrative are oppositional, right? And that's really the underlying argument of the ludology versus narratology debate, right? And I think it was not only distracting, it did long-lasting damage in that particular area, right? Because it framed narrative as oppositional to games. We are not. So the debate started with Jasper Juhl in 1999 saying the computer game is simply not a narrative medium, right? And so the debate framed interactive digital narrative as a scheme to reform games and as a ploy from the humanities to take over game studies. No evidence was ever provided in this regard, really, but this is literally what, as Tanar said, claimed, underlying the drive to reform games as interactive narratives. Nobody, to my knowledge, has ever, had such an agenda. Says, well, there's different things: economic reason, elitist reasons, and academic colonialism. Right? But what it did is, one particular thing is it narrowed the perspective on narrative to the Eurocentric novel and the Hollywood movies. And there are many other forms, as I will point out later on. And we see that in the publications of ludologists, because when they talk about narrative, they say, oh, here's the novel, here's the film, here's literature. And I've marked that here in this particular quote. Right? And that is a particular problem, and I will talk about that too. But I mean, narrative fundamentalism creates a perspective that at best there can be an uneasy compromise between game and narrative elements. Alright? And this position exists both in academia and for professional practice. And in academia, this means to combine sort of game analysis plus narrative analysis to understand interactive digital narratives. And in the professional sphere, it's the division between game design and narrative design, and mechanics versus cinematics, right? And in the last couple of years, we had games that were lauded for their wonderful narrative, right? One particular successful one was The Last of Us 1 and 2, right? And let's look into where this narrative really is. Right? Part 1 has over 2 hours of cinematics. Right? So this wonderful, narrative chemistry and relationship between, the guy and the girl in this, the man who brings around and tries to keep this young girl safe. Well, all of this, or nearly all of it, happens in a movie, right? And in part 2 it gets even worse. It's 4 hours and 30 minutes of cinematics, right? And if we look at a title like Uncharted 4, where, now our thief Drake, our hero, now is married and actually has a relationship, and I mean, super interesting. This is also how it should be, from this sort of much more simplistic earlier depictions. But how do we see this relationship? Well, in 6 hours and 10 minutes of cutscenes. Right? This is not interactive narrative. This is falling back on older forms of narrative. This is narrative fundamentalism as it's applied in the practice. Right? And this is a long-term effect of the ludology versus narratology debate, because it influenced research directions and also education of future designers. And this influence is very much alive even today. Right? I mean, if you don't know about the narratology versus ludology debate, it was a debate in game studies from about 1999 to 2005. It has never been resolved, but I mean, here are the effects of it. Right? And the debate really entrenched the division between game mechanics and narrative as 2 different aspects. Right? And it restricted research and development also in its Eurocentric understanding of narrative. And it ignored contemporary developments in narratology. That's the other thing. There was basically no narratology that happened in the debate. There was a single actual narratologist who was ever part of the debate. In the first issue, Mary-Laurie Ryan had a paper in the first issue of Game Studies, which was never cited by any of the ludologists. Right? And no other person in the debate is actually a narratologist. It was sort of a name invented by the ludologists for people like Janet Murray and Henry Jenkins. And if we talk about the effects of that, for example, the game writing program at the University of Skövde in Sweden which is one of the few BAs in game writing you have worldwide, it was until recently entirely predicated on script writing. Film script writing, cinematic script writing. This is what was taught there. I know that, I work with the people there. Right? We're now trying to reform into something, but this is how we have created a game writer, by giving them a script writing education. Right? And that of course creates then perspectives like that. Video games are better without stories, film, television and literature all tell them better. Right? And Ian is not wrong. The question is, what narrative are we talking about? Because if we're trying to replicate the kinds of narrative that film, television and literature tell, then we will always be in a losing proposition. Right? And that's actually kind of boring. We need to rethink what narrative in games are, because this is unwinnable. But he's also wrong, because interactive narrative is an opportunity to do something in terms of narrative that cannot be done in film, television and literature. And I will come to that. The other problem is narrative indifference. And what I mean by that? Well, it means that we have papers and we have developers talking about narrative, using terms around narrative like story, storytelling, narrative, without ever defining what they mean. Right? So I throw narrative or story in my paper, but what that actually means I never define. I might have an understanding, I just never make that clear. Right? And that means I'm applying concepts from the practice or from other academic areas without any critical assessment. And here is a concrete example. I'm not going to name names, but it's actually in my book. Right? Where in the same paper, story has all these different meanings. It's a personally meaningful game experience. It means campaign. It means gameplay. It means the social actions possible in that game, and it's sort of a player agency at story level. So it's only a particular thing that a player can influence. And for all of these things in one single paper, the word story is used. So we see a problem here, right? And I mean, this is another thing, and yes, this is from 2006, but I don't think it has changed a lot. Right? Often the most significant reason behind a particular choice of theory is that AI researchers find it easier to work with models that a previous researcher has already translated into AI jargon and applied in some previous computer program. And yes, this is a paper, Narrative Models, Narratologies meets Artificial Intelligence. Right? So this is unfortunately still a popular practice. Oh, there's this prop guy, he segmented narrative in some way. Oh my god, I can use that for my AI. If I hear prop one more time, I'm probably going to scream. I mean, literally, I think 2 years ago I got an email from a student like, oh, I found this prop thing and you're such an expert in this area, can you help me with that? I'm like, please use Google Scholar and see how many papers we have about prop and... Okay, and so here are some examples of uncritical use of concepts. Things like, there's a universal story structure that needs to be used. Narrative coherence and interactivity are in conflict, the narrative paradox. Game design and narrative design are separate. Cinematics are the best way to convey narrative. Aristotelian story arc. We don't have time. Just, you know, no, there is no Aristotelian story arc. Please read the Poetics and look in different translations. You will not find the term arc. Narrative can be added at last step to game. There are foundation rules of storytelling that always apply. No, they don't. And they don't exist. The addition of interactivity is only a matter of degree. No, it's not. And you know, the hero's journey is a good model to use for interactive narrative. We will get to that. Right, and every narrative needs to have conflict and a climax. No. Good. So issues from narrative fundamentalism and indifference. We often have no use for critical assessment possible, or there is no use for critical assessment possible if meaning of such terms, like story in a paper, it's not defined, when it becomes the critic's interpretation what it means. And that means we cannot compare, we cannot move forward. That is one of the big problems, right? And that's a hindrance to progress in research and development. It's a misunderstanding of what interactive narrative is. And it creates, you know, what in an upcoming paper, Miriam and Atari and me are calling theoretical failures. So, so Miriam and me have worked on some of these issues for a while. So we had a paper in 2019 we called Challenges of IDM Research and Teaching. We identified a number of particular challenges and Miriam made wonderful depictions of them. But one is what we call the Groundhog Day, and it's the endless circle of using the same adapted methods and vocabulary yielding limited results. Right? We need to restart. We need to look, are things that we get from narratology actually useful and from literary studies for the things that we are creating, which might be fundamentally different. Or, to put it like that, this is not a faster horse. Right? So, but if we approach a car as a horse, we describe the horseness of a car, not a car on its own terms. And that's the problem if we use narratological terms that are trained on print literature, on interactive narrative. Basically what we're using is we describe the literariness, the cinema-ness, the stage play-ness of our interactive narrative if we use theories from these areas. Right? But we're not describing and understanding IDN on its own terms. Right, and yeah, there's a paper that we will give in a couple of weeks at iKids where we will categorize theoretical failures, so that's a bit of a cliffhanger, you have to wait for that. But here's a side note. Watch this talk. Be afraid. I mean, Sebastian is doing wonderful work in his particular area. He's the head of design at Imperial College London. Okay? And he's looking into some of, I mean, in this talk he talks about motivational theories that many of us have been thinking about or have been using in evaluation. Flow theory, and appreciation theory and self-determination theory. And he kind of proves that flow theory isn't working. And that many of these things that we take as granted are underspecified. So that's coming from a different perspective, but I'm just saying we have issues here. Okay, with all of that, let's start over. Why is narrative important and what is it actually? And what is interactive digital narrative? So I mean, why are we interested in narrative? Why is it important? Because I mean, narrative is such an essential thing for us, right? It determines who we are, our reality, our memory. Our long-term memory most likely is narrative. And I mean, here are some things, you know, that neuroscience has now found out and is working on. Making the connection between how our brain works and our memory works and how we identify ourselves or we create identity through narratives. And here's just a Google Scholar search on sort of these topics and you see how many papers exist on that topic. Right? It is a fundamental way of us being humans, narrative. Right? And here it's some just in bit more concrete references on that. Right? I mean, an architecture of narrative memory, neuroscience and narrative. Narratives bridge the divide between distant events and episodic memory. Narrative self in modulating episodic memory. So it is absolutely crucial. But it's also how we're getting influence. Right? All of us. Good or bad. So I mean, here are two examples. Right? before the war against Ukraine started, before the invasion of Ukraine started, there was a narrative. And it was the narrative penned by Vladimir Putin that basically says Ukraine shouldn't be a country, it should be part of Russia. That was published and happened before the war started. The narrative was there first. And it's a narrative that he's been perpetuating for a number of years, but this is the most clear-cut one on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Basically says Ukraine needs to be wiped out. That state shouldn't exist, right? But of course we also have positive examples of narratives, right? I mean, Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream," that's a narrative, right? And it created change. I know the US isn't where it, maybe could be, but progress has clearly been made, right? So think about all of these are narratives. The stolen 2020 election, the COVID vaccine is dangerous, there's a secret world government, LGBTQI+ are a danger to society, the Ukraine is not a country. All of these are narratives. But also, I have a dream. Or things like, first we ignore you, then we laugh at you, then we fight you, then you win. That's Mahatma Gandhi. School strike for climate. Ireland will win the World Cup. I mean, it has to start somewhere.
I had a dream.
Right? Exactly. Right? So, and when it comes to games, and that's kind of interesting, yeah, but the Jesper Juhl that I already mentioned says, games resist many of the more complex themes we can imagine, such as love, ambition, and social conflict, because they are not easily implemented in rules. Well, I think interactive digital narratives provide a solution for that problem. And of course, most of the games shown by Brenda yesterday, I would classify them as interactive digital narratives. So what are actually interactive digital narratives? So, I mean, here is my, and I admit, very academic definition. Interactive digital narrative is a narrative expression in various forms implemented as a multimodal computational system with optional analog elements and experienced through a participatory process in which interactors have a non-trivial influence on progress, perspective, content, and/or outcome. Oh yes, I admit it's a mouthful. But basically in interactive digital narratives, interactors influence the virtual world and are co-responsible for the narrative experience. The work is dynamic and reactive, and the audience are participants. And I understand interactive digital narrative as an umbrella term that is more than one form. It encompasses a range of manifestations, including narrative video games, interactive documentaries, journalistic interactives, AV, AR, VR experiences, and probably forms we haven't seen yet. And here are some examples, and these are actually all examples from people in the INCORE network. To the lower right, we have Gaming for Peace, actually a work created by Mats Haar and his company for training peacekeepers from European armies. We have 1986, which is an interactive digital narrative that teaches Hungarian students about the communist times in Hungary, and Starlight Stadium is also another participant of INCORE, and she with her team have created this to train people about human rights violations. Right?